The sun is shining, the birds are chirping, the bacon is sizzling. Welcome to the Daily Swole.
Welcome everyone to episode 171 of The Daily Mother Swole. Look at my huge bicep. Look at my huge bicep. Look at that thing. It's like my freaking elbow ate a grapefruit. It's like my arm is a python. I just ate a small rabbit. Welcome to episode 171. Thank you for joining me on a Monday where I've had way too much caffeine on far too little sleep. So I am really, like, my heart rate is jumping, but I'm like sleeping standing up. So this is all surface emotion and awakeness. Don't let this hair and this beard fool you. I am actually sleep swolling right now. I have actually done so many podcasts and so many live broadcasts that I can actually do this while sleeping. So instead of sleepwalking, I sleep broadcast. I make content while I sleep. So this is actually... I'll let you know when I wake up. I'll probably be awake in time for a Swolenormous Premium accountability meeting at 1 p.m. But for right now, I'm just sleeping. So I'll be surprised as you are when I wake up and I see what I actually talked about today. That being said, thank you for joining me. If you're new to the broadcast, welcome, welcome, welcome. Triple live broadcast every day at 12 noon Eastern time, Facebook Live, Periscope, Busker. You could also find every single episode on my YouTube channel, YouTube at Swolenormous. Here is the card. The links are also in my profile on Periscope. So YouTube, Swolenormous. You can find every episode of the Daily Swole. I have 600 videos, all sorts of vlogs, workout videos, breakdowns, tons and tons of great content. So check that out if you haven't already. And if you like to listen, catch this as a podcast on SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. So SoundCloud, Swolenormous, iTunes, you can look up Daily Swole and or Swolenormous, and also on Stitcher. So you can actually listen to this show every day. All 171 episodes are online. The latest news, the latest and the greatest. Thank you for everyone that has checked out and shared, liked, and supported that the Spotlight video on Facebook. So if you haven't checked out my Facebook page, facebook.com/Swolenormous, check it out. If you're not following me on Facebook, follow me on Facebook. And also, it's pinned at the top. It's my latest Spotlight video that I just shared with my Facebook page. So check that out. Give it a view. Give it a like if you like it. I'm sure you will. It's a great message. And if you can, share that. Send it to people that need to see it. It's a great message for anyone, for all ages. It's not just fitness related. It's following your passion, following what's true to yourself. So watch that video. It's really short. It's about a minute. And everyone has a minute just to watch something that's going to amp you up, especially on a fucking Monday. I'm really fired up today. Today's episode is the most aesthetic muscle in the upper body. And when I say aesthetic, I mean visually appealing, visually appeasing, fits the upper body artistic flow of the way the human body should look. It is a muscle that is commonly undertrained, that is commonly underdeveloped. It is a very important muscle because this muscle will give the upper body, will give the shoulder, will give the upper torso more of a V taper, which everyone likes. Will give it more of a three-dimensional appearance, which everyone likes. And you might like these things without even realizing that you like them. This is something that the human eye automatically assesses, notices, and calculates. If you remember the movie Terminator 2, how could you forget? Made by the greatest actor in all time. If you have never seen the Terminator 2, you have to watch it. It's called Judgment Day with Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's a fantastic movie. It's one of his greatest pictures. You have to watch this movie because when the Terminator sees a target or sees a person, you see a little grid and it scans. The human body does that too. It's kind of ironic that that's a machine doing it, but the human body, the mind, is a machine in itself that can analyze and discern proportions right away. That's why you might see someone and immediately, instinctually, like, that person looks weird. That person doesn't train legs, or their legs are really skinny. Their head looks weird, or their eyebrows are too close together, too far apart. The body is always assessing things in their environment to notice anomalies, things that are different, things that are, maybe dangerous, things that aren't, probably safe, or that could lead to danger, that could lead to harm, that just look off. The body knows what's right. The body knows what's accurate. Thanks, Triplet. I appreciate the support. The Pond Digger. Eric Triplet, the Pond Digger, is on my Facebook Live. So represent, if you haven't checked out his Snapchat and his Facebook posts and his Facebook feed, check out Eric Triplet, the Pond Digger. Awesome, awesome work and amazing stuff on Snapchat too. Super, super cool. Amazing koi ponds, and just the architecture and the artistic design is brilliant. So it's really a pleasure to see something different than all the standard stuff you normally see on social media. So definitely props to you, man. It definitely spices up my day when I'm poking through social. So thank you for that and all the support that you've given me thus far. Sons of Anarchy, Thor. Yeah, I'm all the above. Yeah, I'm Thor. Jax or Opie. I'm Aquaman. I'm freaking Game of Thrones. I look like that football player. I look like that wrestler. I look like everyone you can, everyone and more. I look like, I don't know. I'm not saying things to toot my own horn, but these are all things I've heard of pretty much since yesterday. I get it every freaking day. So that guy missing a leg. All right. Yeah, the guy from the first form guy. Okay. I'm look like the tripod dude, but he's a cool guy. He's an awesome. You're not OP. No, I appreciate that. The most aesthetic muscle in the upper body is the posterior deltoid. I'm not going to leave that to any more, drum roll first. Posterior deltoid. People don't train the posterior deltoid. Undertrained, flat, rounded shoulder. This leads to compensations with the upper body. This leads to an improper and misalignment with the shoulder joint. The shoulder joint is going to be rounded forward. Think of the head of the humerus, the ball and socket joint, like a bullseye. It's off that bullseye. It's not lined up properly. This is very dangerous for the shoulder because the shoulder is a very mobile joint and it needs as much stability as it can get. So you need to train all these muscles evenly. If you want to look at someone from the side, you don't want to see just tight, someone rolling, rounding in, looking like freaking, Quasimodo and all internally rotate. You want someone that has a nice 3D physique, and that point, that little jagged muscle on the back of the shoulder, the posterior deltoid, is very small, but very important with the aesthetic appeal, and not only that, but the safety. So how do you hit the posterior deltoid more? Well, the posterior deltoid works a lot of times when you're doing any kind of like shoulder extension or any kind of horizontal abduction, moving the body away when the humerus is at 90 degrees. So you're pinching your shoulder blades back, you're rowing, you're doing rows, you're doing any kind of pull-up, you're working the posterior deltoid. But how do you isolate? The thing is with those muscles that are tiny, like the posterior deltoid, is that when they're not trained often, when they're weaker, when they're more underactive, when they're not firing well, is when you do larger muscle groups like a row or like a pull-up, those muscles don't engage. Even though you would logically like, oh, you're working them, and they are working, they're there, they exist, they're still attached and they're still firing. They're just not firing well because they're not really turned on. So the larger muscle groups take over. So when you're not isolating, when you're doing compound movements or multi-joint movements or multi-muscle movements, when you're working the lats, when you're looking at the rhomboids, when you're working the biceps, the latissimus dorsi, you're working so many other muscles that are stronger, more powerful, more capable than the posterior deltoid, that those muscles generally don't get developed even when you're working major movements like a row or like a pull-up. So in order to get these muscles kind of ramped up and give them a head start or help them catch up, you have to isolate. Now, how do you isolate the posterior deltoid? First off, there are some great ways to take out things like body momentum. They're great exercise in terms of the equipment in order to keep tension on the muscle. Things like cables and bands are absolutely phenomenal for the posterior deltoid. Even you could argue equally or greater or better than dumbbells in many aspects, unless you're an expert and you have great muscle control. Bands and cables can be very, very effective because there's more constant tension in line with the posterior deltoid. Now, of course, I can't demonstrate right now, but you can definitely stay tuned on my YouTube channel, on Facebook, as I will be posting. My next exercise video will likely be something along the lines of a posterior deltoid isolation movement. When you are hitting the posterior deltoid, one of the things to understand is the general movements of the joint. moving out to the side when your arm is at about 90 degrees, when your humerus is about 90 degrees, like if your arms are outside like a T, that is going to be the angle where the posterior deltoid will get the most action. Now, here's what a lot of people do. They keep their pinkies up. Let's say you're lying prone on a bench, which is a great way, or you're standing up and you're pulling down with cables, or using the reverse pec deck machine, or using a band. I'm actually not going to get into such details with the words because if you're not familiar, you're not going to know what the hell I'm talking about. But any posterior deltoid exercise, make sure that the weight, the resistance, is in line with the force. The movement is in line with the force against gravity. A lot of times people are using dumbbells, and as you go through the range of motion with a free weight, the resistance on the muscle is going to change as you go through the motion. With a cable, with a band, you're more able to keep constant pressure on the muscle and isolate that posterior head. What I want you to think about, what I want you to keep in mind before I post this next exercise video on my YouTube channel, again, for those that are just joining me, youtube.com/Swolenormous. So Swolenormous on YouTube, that's where all these workout videos are posted. And also you can find things, preview videos on my Instagram and on my Facebook page, is to perform at the end of the movement an external rotation because you have a different component of the posterior deltoid. The posterior deltoid has a very limited range of motion. So as you come all the way to the front, you're not getting a lot of action all the way in the front. That's going to be more for the scapula when you do that retraction. Once you get out about 45 degrees, and then you start doing that short range of motion, 45 degrees to the front, back to a complete T-form position, that's where the posterior deltoid is going to have the most action. Once your arms go behind the body, you're just doing an isometric for the posterior deltoid. You're working your rhomboids and anything that you're pinching your shoulder blades back with, the middle trapezius and the rhomboids. You're not working the posterior deltoids anymore. You're not getting more action. So there really isn't any point to pinch your shoulder blades back as you come all the way up. Yes, you're getting other muscles involved, but if you want to truly isolate the posterior deltoid, it's even better to keep your shoulders rounded forward. Another thing you can keep in mind is to externally rotate, rotating the palms out to the side as if you're going to shake two people's hands while you're in, let's say, a prone position lying on your stomach or your chest on a bench. Rotate your arms out to the side so your thumbs are up at the finishing movement. The external rotation is going to really pinch and contract and, I want to say, just dig into that posterior deltoid even more. Now, these movements, if you're on the podcast, even if you're watching, could be a little over the head. This is going to come into play more with my exercise demo that you're going to catch on YouTube. With the repetition scheme, very small muscle, more of a stabilizer, less power, you're going to need to do higher repetitions to failure. There are two different ways you can really overload the posterior deltoid. You could do super heavy partial reps. You could also do lighter weight and much higher, very slow and controlled isolation movements. Doing exercises where you're doing, let's say, a 5-pound isometric hold, where you're holding at that finishing point as long as you can, to doing 5 or 10 pounds, 30, 40, 50, 60 reps, to even doing partial range where you're just doing maybe a few inches with super heavy dumbbells, maybe 20, 30, 40 pounds, just rocking the weight back and forth can really dig into the muscle tissue. The point is, failure and overload and higher repetition is super, super important for the posterior deltoid. Not going to be super successful to do 5 or 6 reps isolated for the posterior deltoid. It's not like a concentration curl for the bicep muscle. The posterior deltoid is much more sensitive and much more receptive to higher repetitions in general. Of course, I can't speak for everyone. But going to absolute failure, doing drop sets, going from a heavyweight to a lighter weight to a lighter weight subsequently with no rest until you can't move your freaking arms, doing isometric holds at the top, cable face pulls, that's another angle. Cable face pulls where you're pulling here. I'm not necessarily a big fan of that last movement. Face pulls are usually here and people rotate up. It's a little bit risky. I don't personally do them. I don't personally like that exercise for the most part just because of the sudden you're working your rhomboids, you're working your middle trapezius, and all of a sudden at the last moment, you're hitting all posterior rotator cuff, which can all of a sudden, tweak pretty easily. Now, this is not necessarily, that's not, for someone who's more experienced, but for the average person, face pulls are generally going to be done improperly. I prefer much more keeping the elbows up at 90 degrees. It's very hard to recommend things to people across across a live broadcast or across a podcast just because I don't know what's going on with their shoulder. So these are not recommendations. These are suggestions. These are things that I do. Now, the external rotation is a great twist, is a great tweak, obviously, with a cable or it's going to be harder with a cable. But you can also do posterior, you could do your rear raises with your hands out, with your palms, your shoulders actually rotated the entire time. That's a great way to do the posterior deltoid too. Again, easier to see when I do my demonstration. My main point to hammer, the head of the nail for this episode, is to start thinking about aesthetics differently, to start thinking about these smaller muscle groups. And it's hard to visualize it if you're not an expert or if you're not in the gym all the time, but you might not have been aware that the posterior deltoid either existed or is that important, because there's the anterior, the medial head, and there's the posterior head. And those three muscles are like a triangle. That's why it's called a deltoid. When either one of them is not working properly, you're losing additional stability while you're trying to put force production on a joint. You have the rotator cuff underneath stabilizing. Now, think about this, the reason why a lot of people have shoulder injuries. You have the rotator cuff underneath that you can't see that might not be stabilizing properly because they're not getting targeted properly with training and with proper function. Then you have the deltoid muscles that provide a lot of force and internal tension that resist the external force of lifting weights, groceries, children, whatever it is. The deltoids are imbalanced. Let's say the anterior head is by far, which is usually the case, by far more developed and more activated than the posterior. Then you have the rotator cuff underneath that's not functioning properly. So you have an imbalanced force-producing muscle like the deltoid, imbalanced to the front, and then you have an under-stabilizing rotator cuff underneath. This is why people get hurt. That is supremely the reason why people get hurt. It's so explained in layman's terms. You have an imbalance in the force-producing muscles, and you have an instability in the stabilizing muscles. That is why doing things like the prone cobra, like I've talked about in my premium group, doing these stabilizing exercises, doing these corrective exercises, doing these external rotation exercises with bands, warming up, doing all of these corrective activation movements, these rehabilitation exercises are super, super important. The rehabilitation is what's going to heal you from an injury, but doing them before you get hurt will greatly prevent that injury from ever occurring. Not to mention, when you have proper balance with the joint, you're going to decrease the risk of injury, yes. You're also going to increase your force production because when the joint is properly aligned and has proper stability, you can build more upon it. So if you have a stronger foundation for a building, you could build a taller building. You could build a building with stronger materials that can withstand more weather, et cetera, et cetera. You're not going to build a 100-story building on a shitty foundation made out of straw. You need to have a strong base. Extremely important to focus on the weaker points. Whenever I do shoulders, I always do rear and side first. I always start with rear. I really always start with rear. Very rarely do I start with the medial head with doing like side raises, and extremely rarely do I ever start with anterior deltoid work. For the most part, I ignore doing the front of the shoulder because it gets so much work already, and I try to create more balance. I always hit rear and side, and sometimes I do some anterior deltoid. That's just me. I'm not interested in, I'm not trying to build supremely at this point. I focus on what's aesthetic. And this is another reason why people think I'm either heavier than I am or I'm stronger than I am. Because I don't worry so much about strength, I'm worrying more about aesthetics and balance and stability. But because I have an aesthetic physique, because I'm evenly balanced, I look stronger and I look heavier. Or I'm heavier, or for some people, I'm heavier than they think I am because it's so evenly distributed. They're like, wow, you weigh 200 pounds? I don't look 200 because it's everywhere. It's not just on my upper body. It's not just on my lower body. Even distribution of muscle mass and of physique and aesthetics, and I've said this before, is a great indicator of whether or not someone is healthy and whether someone is balanced. The way they look, if they look balanced, a lot of times they are balanced because they have even distribution of muscle. you have even tension all over the body. And of course, with massage and yoga, you're going to have decreased tension and more relaxed appearance and more relaxed internal tension. But if you have even pulling all over your body, you're going to be balanced. You're going to have more support. You don't want to be imbalanced because then you're pulling in improper directions, and that's when you're at risk for injury. And also, just a funky looking physique. You don't want rounded shoulders. You don't want upper cross syndrome. You don't want to be shrugged up. You don't want to be rotated. You want to be balanced. So start focusing on the posterior deltoid. Start working with some bands. Do some more higher repetitions, slower movements, and start externally rotating at the end of the movement if you're lying, or if you're bending forward, or if you're lying prone on a bench. Add that little twist at the end and a nice pause, and you'll see how that burn and that development greatly increases. Isolate, 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 and then integrate that with your other exercise with shoulders and with back training. Very important topic. Stay tuned on my YouTube channel. In the next couple days, I will get up an exercise video that shows the posterior deltoid isolation, at least one activation exercise for the posterior deltoid, one movement that's going to really separate and create separation of the shoulder and create that nice point and that nice development. Ah, yeah, the shoulder crew, shoulder crew has shown up. So, other side notes, 1 million hearts on Periscope by New Year's, so I think we're well on track, so keep on floating those hearts. Thank you for the likes on Facebook and the support on Facebook Live, and also Busker. Thank you, Dennis. Remember, YouTube at Swolenormous for all my videos, exercise videos, all the good stuff, 600 videos of varying ridiculousness, youtube.com/Swolenormous, yes indeed. And like, share, and distribute. Let's get out that video I posted on my Facebook. So on my Facebook channel, my Facebook page, Swolenormous, check out the video I just posted, 1 minute for the rest of your life. That's what it's titled. Check it out, like, share it. It's blowing up right now, so definitely all the support on getting that video out there. It's a great message for anyone, for all ages, not just fitness. Also, podcast, SoundCloud, iTunes, and Stitcher. Make sure you check out the podcast, like it on SoundCloud, leave a review for me on iTunes. I appreciate all that support. And I will be here tomorrow for episode 172 of The Daily Mother Swole. Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Try doing a couple of those tweaks for shoulders, higher repetition, slower movements, external rotation, blast it, blast it, blast it. And stay tuned for the next exercise video that is going to show exactly that. I'll see you tomorrow. Peace out. Enjoy the rest of your Monday.
Another.